coming to the last of the 2018 May lectures this year. Just to start, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, and pay my respect to their elders, families, past and present. The local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role and life in these lands. So the May lectures are designed to showcase some of the exciting research that we have in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, and tonight will be no exception to that. This is part of our emphasis on engagement and also outreach and communicating some of those exciting ideas that we've been coming up with. This week we have the pleasure of learning about whether emotional stability is all that it's cracked up to be. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, there's a couple of very interesting topics that came before this as well. Peter Cavall is a lecturer in our school now, previously a postdoctoral research study at the Australian Catholic University. He completed his PhD at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and in Australia and even before has become a leading figure in the area of emotion dynamics, which you'll hear about tonight. And also the use of smartphone technology and experience sampling, which is something that I think a lot of people are starting to turn to for research. Although early in his career, he's already been involved in attracting more than $6.5 million in research funding. He regularly publishes in the very top journals in his field and is a consulting editor of the two top emotional journals. Last year, he was nominated as a rising star of a peak global body in psychological science. Less known, and if that wasn't enough, he's also an accomplished jazz pianist. Pete's research cuts to the core of issues that many people are interested in: how to understand emotion. I'm sure that after tonight we'll hopefully all understand emotion a little bit more. Before I welcome Pete, I'd just like to point out that we're also going to use this hashtag, and we would like to tweet or communicate about some of the exciting things that Pete and I will talk about tonight. If you could welcome Pete. Thank you.
Just for the height difference between Rob and myself, and then I'll get going. So first, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Brock. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the School of Psychological Sciences for the invitation to give the last of the May lectures for 2018. And most of all, thank you to all of you for being here tonight and giving up your free time. Hopefully something of interest will come up during this talk. Now, you might have heard that emotional stability is the key to a happy, fulfilled, and successful life. That your emotions should be less like a roller coaster and a bit more like a merry-go-round, so slow, steady, and predictable. But tonight I'm going to try to convince you that emotional stability may not necessarily be as good as we often think it is. And the reason for that is that emotions are inherently changeable. They're dynamic. And it's precisely because emotions change and fluctuate from one situation to the next, from one moment to the next, that they're actually useful to us. Now, this doesn't mean that we should necessarily always act on our emotions, or that we should let our emotions run rampant and out of control. But trying to avoid the sort of inevitable emotional ups and downs that life brings, if it were even possible, may not be necessary to achieve well-being. So instead, I think what we should do is try to listen to our emotions, notice how and when they change, and use this information to help us. Help us to respond to life's slings and arrows, help us to make progress towards our goals, and hopefully help us to cultivate fulfilling and harmonious relationships with others too. So perhaps when you leave tonight, you'll consider that rather than emotional stability, what we should strive for is to be emotionally flexible. And that maybe emotional flexibility is an important marker of psychological well-being. Now, we've been suspicious about our emotions for a very long time, dating all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. Plato famously likened emotions to a wild horse pulling a chariot that had to be tamed by the charioteer, which represented human reason. And this view was perhaps best epitomised by the Stoic philosophers who followed shortly after, led by Zeno of Citium, who described emotions as a disturbance of the mind, repugnant to reason and against nature. So this very harsh view of emotions as destructive forces was prominent in ancient Greek philosophy, and it survived into modern times. In fact, many early psychologists emphasised the destructive and overwhelming force that emotions can wreak on our lives. So, B.F. Skinner, a very well-known behaviourist, described emotions as not only useless, but also bad for our peace of mind and for our blood pressure. So, are emotions inherently destructive forces? Should we strive to rid ourselves of our emotions altogether, as the characters in Skinner's utopian novel, in which he made his quote in 1948? Well, if emotions are a disturbance of the mind, they're a very common one. This study, the large study conducted with French and Belgian citizens, surveyed about 11,500 people who reported on their daily experiences of emotions using a smartphone app for about 1 week. And what this study revealed was that people are experiencing emotions an awful lot of the time. People reported experiencing positive emotions like joy, love and satisfaction around 40% of the time. Of course, there are inevitable negative emotions to be experienced as well, and people reported experiencing anxiety, sadness, anger and other kinds of unpleasant emotions. Less, but still significantly so, about 15% of the time. And interestingly, they also reported quite often experiencing blends of positive and negative emotions. Just over 30% of the time, people reported feeling some combination of happiness and despair, or the most common combination is in fact love and anxiety, which anyone who's been in love may be able to identify with. So this only leaves about 10% of the time that people weren't feeling an emotion at all. Or in other words, according to this study, the average person might spend about 90% of their waking lives experiencing emotions. Now, this might seem like an awful lot, and perhaps it is an exaggeration, because maybe people were more likely to complete these surveys when feeling emotion than when not. But consider that many of our daily emotions are likely to be more mild than overwhelming passions. And it's possible that they may even go unnoticed unless we actually stop and reflect on how we're feeling. So studies like this reveal that emotions are certainly not rare events. They're part of the fabric of our daily lives. And I think it's difficult to imagine our lives without emotions. So if we can't avoid emotions altogether, if we can't rid ourselves of emotions per se, should we try to keep our emotions stable? This is certainly the wisdom that's been handed down from many of our ancient religions, which emphasise the importance of emotional stability or balance or equanimity. And I think it would be unwise to simply dismiss this inherent wisdom offhand. We should at least consider that it might be true. And modern versions of the spiritual practices also emphasise the importance of emotional stability. So, for example, the founder of the yoga, which is one of the popular streams of yoga today, described health as beginning with firmness in the body, but then deepening to include emotional stability as well. Now, to those of you who are not spiritually inclined, you might not identify with these statements, so perhaps you might identify with some of the secular prophets in our society, like Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world, who claims that the key to success is actually emotional stability. So are they right? Before we answer that question, I think we need to consider how we define and how we measure emotional stability. Now, this is how psychologists have traditionally done it. We simply ask people to ponder the kind of person they typically are, or the kind of person they are in general. And we ask them to agree or disagree with statements like the ones I'm about to show you. So I'd like you to reflect for a moment on whether, in general, you would describe yourself as the kind of person who keeps your emotions under control, or rather somebody who gets overwhelmed by emotions. Are you the kind of person who rarely loses your composure? Or are you easily disturbed, on the other hand? Are you the sort of person who's not really easily bothered by things, or do you get stressed out easily? And finally, simple face-value questions like, are you emotionally stable? Or do you have frequent mood swings? Now, people answer these questions somewhat readily, and we can describe, based on their responses, the degree to which they believe that they're emotionally stable or not. So, people who endorse the blue statements on the left half of the screen would be described as emotionally stable, and those that tend to endorse the red statements on the right would fall towards the emotionally unstable end of the spectrum. Now, this type of emotional stability, or emotional stability defined and measured in this way, is part of a broader constellation of characteristics that are referred to as neuroticism. And neuroticism is one of the basic dimensions of human personality. And it also involves frequent experiences of sadness, anxiety, worry, the tendency to be irritable, easily angered, even hostile, and finally to be self-conscious and sensitive to criticism of others, and to be plagued with feelings of inadequacy. So when you consider that description of this trait, it's probably obvious to you that this is people who score high on this trait, their life doesn't bode very well. And this is indeed what the evidence suggests. There's a lot of robust evidence to suggest that neuroticism predicts worse mental and physical health outcomes. So one famous American psychologist described it thus. He said, neuroticism predicts shorter, less happy, less healthy, and less successful lives to a meaningful extent. Pretty grim picture for those of us who score high on this particular basic dimension of personality. So, if neuroticism is a marker of poor health and emotional stability its opposite, that must be a prerequisite for good health and well-being, right? Question answered, we can all go home. Perhaps it's not that simple, but that's what I'm going to try to argue. And the reason is that we may not have a good idea, we may not have good insight into how our emotions fluctuate from one moment to the next. Let me explain. Psychologists have discovered that self-knowledge is fallible. So when reflecting on who we are, we may forget, or distort, or otherwise misrepresent how we actually behave. So in one creative experiment by Sam Gosling and his colleagues, they invited a group of MBA students into the lab in small groups and asked them to participate in a mock boardroom meeting, and they had them videotaped or filmed while they did this. At the end of the experiment, they asked the students to report how often they had engaged in or performed a number of behaviours. And then they had a group of independent judges watch the films and rate how often those students actually performed those behaviours. Could be observed to be performing those behaviours. And what they found was that people's self-reports of the frequency of these behaviours, common behaviours, corresponded only very weakly with the objective reports taken from the videos. So people misrepresented or distorted how often they engaged in particular behaviours. But interestingly, the correspondence was weakest for undesirable behaviours, things like interrupting others, where there was virtually no relationship whatsoever between how often people said they interrupted others and how often they were observed to interrupt others based on the videos. In another creative study, Simone Vizier and Matthias Mail used a device that's creatively called the ear, the electronically activated recorder. Back in the days when they did this study, this was a small tape recorder that was worn on the belt of participants. So participants wore this recorder for 4 days, and the recorder recorded small sound bites of 30 seconds, roughly 5 times an hour, while they went about their normal daily activities. And again, in this study, they asked participants to report how often they engaged in different behaviours. This time, behaviours that were not particularly desirable or undesirable. And again, there was very little correspondence with how often people thought they did things and how often they actually did things based on the codings of those recordings by a group of research assistants who, as you can imagine, had a Herculean task to listen to every single one of those 30-second recordings of all the participants and code when they had actually performed certain behaviours. So for example, something like having a one-on-one conversation with another person, people's self-reports of how often they did this corresponded almost not at all with how often they were observed to be doing this based on the ear recordings. So these kinds of studies tell us that we may not be particularly accurate when we introspect about our behaviours. But surely we know how we feel. Surely we are accurate when we retrospect or make judgments about our innermost experiences and feelings. Well, actually, as it turns out, research by Daniel Kahneman, who I would like to remind you is a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, and the reason I remind you of that is because psychologists haven't won very many Nobel Prizes, so we like to take every opportunity to celebrate the few that have been awarded to psychologists. So Kahneman and his colleagues asked people to submerge their hands into a bucket of uncomfortably cold water, 14 degrees Celsius, not once but twice. The first time, they did it for 60 seconds, and while they were doing this, they used their other hand, which was not in the bucket, to continuously rate how much pain and discomfort they were experiencing in real time, using a little dial, a little bit like a volume dial on your radio. The second time they did it, they repeated the same thing again, only this time they kept their hand in for an extra 30 seconds, so 1.5 minutes in total. And crucially, in that last 30 seconds, the researchers turned up the temperature gradually by 1 measly degree to 15 degrees Celsius. A perceptibly warmer but still very, very uncomfortable temperature to have your hands submerged in water. And then later, participants remembered which of those two trials they found to be more painful, which one they found easier to cope with, and they selected which of the two trials they'd like to repeat the third time. And what was amazing was that their recollections of pain were actually less for the longer trial, the 90-second trial. And this did not correspond at all with their momentary ratings of pain while they actually had their hands in the bucket. So their pain did slightly decrease in that last 30 seconds for some, not all participants, but overall they experienced a greater amount of pain in that second version of the task. Yet they preferred to do that version again. They reported it as being less painful and easier to cope with. And this nicely illustrates the distinction that Kahneman makes between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self, which we all walk around with at every moment of our lives, going about our activities and experiencing in the moment, doesn't necessarily feed information in a straightforward way to our remembering self, which tries to integrate all of our momentary experiences, but is biased by things like how an experience ended. Now, this doesn't just apply to pain, this applies to emotions as well. And in a study by Ben Zev and colleagues, they asked people using smartphones to rate their momentary experience of positive and negative emotions 8 times a day for a week. And then at the end of the week, to remember how they felt overall during the week. And they compared the intensity of people's emotions on average in their momentary reports and in that last retrospective or remembered report of how intense their positive and negative emotions were. And what they found was a systematic bias. People tended to recall feeling more intense emotions, not just positive, but also negative, than they actually did. So given that self-knowledge is clearly imperfect, and that people's memories and beliefs about their behaviours, and not only their behaviours, but also their inner experiences and feelings, is subject to distortion and bias, how can we trust people's reports of how emotionally stable they are? And a study that directly tested this question back in 2009 showed that people who rate themselves as being generally emotionally stable or unstable don't necessarily display observable signs of emotional instability when we ask them how they feel repeatedly. So these researchers also tracked people's emotions over the course of 4 weeks. And they compared their ratings of emotional stability or instability with their observed fluctuations in momentary feelings across this period of 4 weeks and found very little correspondence. So we're basically not very good at summarising all the ups and downs in our momentary feelings into an overall judgment of how emotionally stable or unstable we are. So, if we want to understand whether emotional stability or instability is good for us, then we really need to study people's momentary experiences and emotions. And in this study, some colleagues and I did this with a group of 200 undergraduate students in Belgium. We asked them 10 times a day for 1 week to report on their momentary experiences. Now here's an example of one person's reports of negative emotions. So on the vertical axis of the graph, you can see the intensity of the negative emotions from 0, not at all, to 100, very intense, over the course of a whole week. And this person showed a lot of fluctuations. They go up and down a lot, and their emotions appear to be unstable. Another person from this study shows quite a different pattern, I hope you'll agree. This person's negative emotions are much slower to change, much less unstable, much more predictable. So now the question is, which of these two people, the unstable, the emotionally unstable, or the emotionally stable person, would we expect to have better well-being, to be better psychologically adjusted and happier in general? Well, we also measured our participants' psychological well-being on a number of different measures, including asking about their depressive symptoms in the last couple of weeks. And what we found was, in this case, the person who showed greater instability, shown in red here, was much lower in depressive symptoms than the person who was emotionally stable. They fell much more towards the bottom end of the spectrum in our sample of depressive symptoms. If we turn to a measure of happiness, we ask people about how satisfied they are with their lives. Here, it flips. The person who's unstable in red reports higher levels of satisfaction with their life than the person whose emotions are more stable and predictable. And finally, another marker of well-being, self-esteem. And again, the unstable person, the emotionally unstable person whose negative emotions fluctuate more frequently, shows higher levels of self-esteem, one of the highest scorers in our sample, compared to the person whose emotions are more predictable and stable. So what's going on here? Now obviously I've cherry-picked these two participants so that they clearly illustrate this pattern, but this was they're representative of the broader pattern that we found and that others have found in many, many studies now. To understand this, I think we need to go back and think about the functions of emotions. And rather than assuming that emotions are inherently dysfunctional and destructive forces, today many researchers who study emotion consider them to serve important functions in human psychology. So emotions draw our attention to opportunities and rewards in our environment. They also draw our attention to threats and punishments. And they help us to mobilise a response towards these important events that could impinge on our well-being and indeed on our survival as well. Emotions also help us track our progress towards goals. And they help us make decisions very quickly. And finally, emotions are very much at the heart of our social relationships, right across the lifespan, from infancy through to old age. And they also help us to navigate social interactions with strangers or people that we don't know and form alliances and groups. But to be able to serve all these functions, it's crucial for emotions to fluctuate and change in response to changes in our environments. So this is why it's essential for emotions to be dynamic and flexible. In other words, to change from moment to moment as we encounter different environments and strive towards different goals. What might it look like if the natural dynamic function of emotions is disrupted? Let's take a concrete example here. So imagine we have a couple, let's call them Faye and Raph, and they're having an argument. We would expect that their level of negative emotion would increase during this argument. So Faye's level of, or intensity of negative emotion is shown here in green, and Raph's is shown in red. Now, some time later, they might be in a totally different context, having dinner with friends. And Faye's level of negative emotion might decrease readily in this new context. She might adapt easily to this new context. This makes her more flexible. Raph, on the other hand, is more emotionally rigid or inflexible because his level of negative emotion remains high in this totally different context. And so his negative emotions spill over from one context or one situation to the next. Now, to quantify this in our research, what we do is measure people's momentary experiences of emotions repeatedly over time, often over the course of a couple of weeks. And then we essentially calculate how autocorrelated or self-predictable their emotions are. In other words, how much does their level of emotion at any moment predict their emotion at the next moment in the future? And this tells us how self-predictable a person's emotions are, and therefore we think how much their emotions are open to novel inputs, novel influences. Now, if emotions are strongly predictable over time, this indicates that they're resistant to change. It suggests that they've sort of taken a life of their own, and they've become impervious to outside influence. And this might undermine their basic function, which is to change and fluctuate from moment to moment. And this is what we refer to as emotional inertia, the tendency for emotions to be self-predictable over time. For the remainder of the talk, I'm going to use that little red icon there to symbolize emotional inertia, because you can see that E stands for emotion, and a little arrow pointing back to itself means that emotions predict themselves over time. Now, as it turns out, one of the earliest studies to look at emotional inertia connected it with none other than neuroticism. And this was well before the advent of the smartphone. It was published in 1998. So Jerry Soules, pictured here, and his colleagues asked a group of people to report on their momentary emotions 8 times a day for 7 days. And they did it using paper and pencil diaries. Now, to remind the participants that they should fill out their diaries at 8 moments each day that were randomly selected, they fitted them with these state-of-the-art Seiko RC1000 watches, which came with the ability to pre-program them with alarms. This might seem ridiculous, but these are the efforts and extents that researchers had to go to just 20 years ago to collect this kind of data. And what they found was that people who rated themselves as being high on neuroticism, which I'll remind you includes items asking about experiencing frequent mood swings and emotional instability, had higher levels of emotional inertia. Their emotions were more self-predictable over time. But, crucially, they also reported or showed more intense reactions to daily stressful events in this same study. So, neuroticism is related to being more reactive to events, to unpleasant events in particular, but also for emotions to be more predictable over time. So how do we reconcile these two findings? A more recent study, I think, can help us understand. And this is a study done by a team of researchers led by Richard Davidson, very famous neuroscientist who's pictured here holding hands with the Dalai Lama, just to give you an indication of how wide his renown stretches. They brought participants into the lab and they put them into an MRI scanner, which scanned their brain activity while they viewed a series of unpleasant, upsetting images. And they also measured people's levels of neuroticism using a similar measure to the items I've showed you before. And what they found was, first of all, that everybody, when they viewed these images, showed reliable increases in activity in a region of the brain called the amygdala. This is a small almond-shaped region in the brain that's known to be involved in emotional responding. But crucially, people who scored higher on neuroticism showed longer, more persistent activation in this area after the images were presented, after the images had disappeared. It took longer for this area of the brain to return to baseline. So this suggests that while people who score high neuroticism might react more strongly to unpleasant events initially, their negative emotions also tend to linger on and persist for longer, and also spill over into other contexts. And it's this lack of ability to recover effectively from unpleasant emotions that we think is one of the key processes involved in emotional inertia. And I'll come back to that issue in a moment. But let's return now to the issue of emotional inertia, because as it turns out, it's not just related to neuroticism. And even before Jerry Sauls and his colleagues studied how people high in neuroticism show higher levels of inertia, John Gottman had already discovered in his research on marital equality and divorce in married couples that couples where one or both partners showed higher levels of emotional inertia have worse relationship outcomes. And the way that he did this was to bring couples into the lab and ask them to have a heated argument, which is not a difficult thing for married couples to do. And videotaped them while they were doing this, and also measured a number of different psychophysiological indices of emotional responding. And what he and his colleagues found in a number of studies was that when a couple included somebody who had higher levels of emotional inertia, which in this case meant that their behavioural expressions of emotions were more self-predictable over time in this interaction, they tended to have lower marital quality. And crucially, this wasn't just for negative emotions, but also for positive emotions. So even couples who have emotions, positive emotional expressions that are inflexible or self-predictable, tend to show lower marital quality. But the way I first learned about emotional inertia was from this gentleman up here, Peter Googans. And his research was conducted initially in this university, actually, the University of Melbourne, with colleagues in the Department of Psychology or the School of Psychology. And they used a similar approach to John Gottman and his colleagues, but this time to study interactions between adolescents, teenagers, and their parents. They brought them into the lab, and again, they asked them to have an argument. Again, a very easy task for people to engage in, and rather emotionally evocative. And what they found again was that adolescents whose behavioural expressions of emotion were more predictable across time, more inflexible, or more inert, were more likely to be diagnosed with clinical depression, known as major depressive disorder. And again, this was not only the case for negative, but also for positive emotional expressions. So this suggests that having emotions that are inflexible and non-responsive to changes in the environment, and perhaps also to one's own efforts to regulate or modify those emotions, may be a kind of a risk factor for mental health problems. Now, a similar line of work in developmental psychology actually had already found similar results a number of years earlier. So Tom Hollenstein and his colleagues have also studied how adolescents interact with their parents using very similar kinds of paradigms or very similar kinds of tasks to the one we've just been talking about. But these researchers think of emotions as emerging in the interaction between two people. And so the way that they plot them or describe how emotions change is in this kind of two-dimensional grid. So each square on this grid represents a joint emotional state between a mother, in this case, and her child, an adolescent. So the circles represent how long the couple or the dyad, the parent and their child, spend in this state. This state might be the mother expressing positive emotion while the child expresses negative emotion. The size of the circle represents the duration, so bigger circles, longer amounts of time spent in that space. And the lines joining up the circles represent transitions from one emotional state to another. And when Hollenstein and his colleagues study adolescents and their parents in these kinds of interactions, they find that the couples or the dyads vary greatly in terms of how their emotional interactions look. So some look a bit like this, and others look very different. And again, they find that the parent-child dyads that are more rigid, emotionally rigid, which they define as spending more time in a limited number of emotional states, making fewer transitions between those states, as shown on the left, they tend to have more psychological problems than the parent-child pairs who are more emotionally flexible, which means that they vary across different states more readily and spend less time in a particular emotional state. And they've found across a number of studies that emotional rigidity defined in this way is related to child anxiety, depression symptoms, even aggression in children, and it predicts future mental health outcomes for both mothers and daughters. And it also seems to decrease through interventions which are designed to reduce childhood aggression, for example. So you can think of emotional rigidity as defined by these developmental psychologists as kind of the two-person version of emotional inertia. So let me just take a moment to pause and sort of summarise the evidence that I've presented so far. What we know from dozens of studies so far is that emotional inertia, the tend predictable and inflexible across time, is related to a host of markers of reduced well-being, including neuroticism, lower marital satisfaction, lower self-esteem, lower satisfaction with life, the amount or the level of depressive symptoms that people report at a given moment, but also there seems to be increased vulnerability to development of future clinical depression among those who display higher levels of emotional inertia. So there's a kind of accumulating evidence that inertia may be a kind of early warning sign for the future onset of mental health problems and in particular depression. Now, given that depression is such a common and debilitating condition, we decided it's important to try to understand the processes underlying emotional inertia, to try to understand what causes it better. I'd like to share with you some of our findings and some findings from other labs. So first, we thought, given that neuroticism has been related to both emotional inertia on one hand and impairments or problems with recovery, emotionally recovering from negative and unpleasant events on the other, perhaps this impaired recovery, emotional recovery, is what was driving inertia. And to investigate this, we brought people into the lab and we showed them films, upsetting films. For example, scenes from Spielberg's Schindler's List. And we asked them afterwards to sit and wait during a kind of rest or recovery period and just stare at the screen. And we then asked them how they felt, how upset or unpleasant they felt, both after the film and after they had a chance to recover. And this gave us a way of indexing how well people can recover emotionally from upsetting events. But we also asked the same participants to monitor their emotions and to report on the occurrence of upsetting and stressful events in their daily lives using a smartphone app for a week, 10 times a day. And what we found was that individuals who showed slower recovery, both from unpleasant films on the one hand in the lab, but also slower recovery from daily negative and unpleasant events, had higher levels of emotional inertia. So this seems to be crucial in explaining why some people have higher levels of emotional inertia than others. And we know that emotional recovery is not only bad for our mental health, but also for our physical health. And this evidence comes from a recent study based on the Midlife in the United States data set, which is a huge national study of health and well-being of people in their middle age in the United States, as the name suggests. So in this particular study based on these data, they looked at data from over 1,000 people aged in their 50s or 30s to 80s. And they asked them once a day for 8 days to report on the occurrence of upsetting or stressful events and also to report on their emotions. And what they found was, fascinatingly, when people reported a stressful event on a particular day, the extent to which they were still experiencing elevated levels of negative emotions the day after, when, crucially, no additional stressful event occurred, that indexed impaired or blunted or worse recovery, emotional recovery, because their levels of negative emotions remained high, even though the stressful event was not occurring that day, it occurred the day before. And this predicted their physical health 10 years later. So we also wanted to understand what kinds of psychological processes might actually be driving these impairments in recovery, and therefore higher levels of emotional inertia. And one of the best candidate processes that we thought of was something called rumination. This has been studied a great deal in relation to depression in particular, and it involves a tendency to dwell on negative feelings, to rehearse negative thoughts over and over in one's mind. So if you're familiar with Mr. Worry, it's a little bit like that. You can think of Mr. Rumination as his close relative. And what we found in a couple of studies was that people who describe themselves as habitual ruminators, as tending to dwell on the negative and rehearse it over and over again, and also to ask abstract kinds of questions like, why is this happening to me? They tend to have high levels of emotional inertia, both in terms of their emotional behaviours in the lab, and also in terms of their feelings and the way that their feelings fluctuate in daily life. Another process that we studied was something that's called suppression or expressive suppression, but what that really amounts to is hiding your emotions from others, or bottling up your feelings, if you like. And this is a very effortful process. People are quite good at doing this, but it takes a lot of effort. And we found that both people who say that they do this habitually, they tend to bottle up their emotions and not show them to other people. And also people who were instructed to do this in an experiment in the lab showed higher levels of emotional inertia. So while it might be the case that it is possible and we are effective at hiding our behaviours or our behavioural expression of emotions, it makes our behavioural expression of emotions rather rigid and inflexible, as you might expect. But these are the kind of psychological processes that are involved. What about the underlying neural and biological processes that might be giving rise to high levels of inertia? Well, there's some exciting research coming out in the last couple of years that has started to answer that important question as well. So in this study conducted by Christian Moore and his colleagues at Wake Forest University in the US, they brought people into the scanner, into the MRI. They scanned their brain, again, while engaging in an unpleasant emotional task on a computer or on a screen. But they also asked these same people to rate their emotions in daily life for 8 days. And what they found was that people who showed less activation during this unpleasant task in the brain scanner, in a particular region of the brain that is known to be involved in the regulation or management of emotions and which facilitates emotional recovery for upsetting events. So people who had less activation during the task in the scanner in that particular prefrontal region showed higher levels of emotional inertia in their daily lives. So this suggests that the brain networks that are involved in helping to limit the duration and intensity of unpleasant emotions may actually be giving rise to, or partially at least, responsible for higher levels of emotional inertia. Interestingly, another recent study has even looked at possible underlying genetic causes of inertia. So here you can see the 23 pairs of chromosomes that humans have. On the 17th chromosome is many genes, including so-called serotonin transporter gene. And this has been studied quite a lot in the context of psychiatry and medicine in relation to mental health and emotional disorders in particular. And it is thought to be implicated in, again, impairments in the ability to regulate or manage negative emotions, to recover from unpleasant emotions, and it's considered to be a possible vulnerability factor to emotional disorders like depression. Or at least a particular variant of this gene, the short variant of this particular gene, is considered to be a vulnerability factor. And what these researchers did was they genotyped a group of participants. They measured which particular variant of this gene they had, and they also surveyed their emotions in daily life over the course of the week and measured, using those momentary reports of their emotions, their level of emotional inertia. And what they found was that people who had this short version of the serotonin transporter gene, which has been argued to be a vulnerability factor for emotional disorders and related to impairments in emotional recovery, did indeed show high levels of inertia in daily life. Okay, so I've told you about the possible causes of inertia, both in terms of the psychological processes and potentially the underlying neural and biological contributors. But I don't want you to go away thinking that this is all bad news and there's nothing we can do about it. So what are some of the things that people might be able to do to reduce emotional inertia? And before I start talking about those, I'd like to hasten that this is very preliminary research, so I'm not trying to make any specific recommendations here, but we have some idea about the kinds of things that might reduce inertia based on these few studies. The first is a recent study coming out of Singapore by Eddie Tong, where they asked people to describe to what extent they live their life in the present moment. And what they found was that people who report living the life from moment to moment and not dwelling on the past, but rather being in the present, showed lower levels of emotional inertia in daily life. And as you've probably heard, this is part of a broad concept called mindfulness, the tendency to try and live in the present moment. So there's some evidence, or some suggestive evidence, that cultivating mindfulness might be a way to increase one's experience of emotions in the moment and to limit their spread or persistence from one moment to the next to reduce emotional inertia. Another finding, perhaps less practical, is that in fact alcohol can have a similar effect. So in this study, but it's easier to do than practicing mindfulness, that's for sure. In this study, they brought participants into the lab and they had them interact in small groups, just an unstructured interaction of some kind. They didn't give them any instructions. Now, half of the participants, they gave 3 alcoholic drinks. The other half, they gave placebo. 3 drinks that they believed to be alcoholic and that were just laced with the tiniest bit of alcohol to give them the proper aroma. And then they videotaped these people during their interactions. And what they looked at was actually how much they smiled. A certain kind of smile, known as the Duchenne smile, which is considered to be a kind of genuine smile, which really expresses genuinely felt positive emotions. And they found that people in the alcohol condition, who were randomly assigned to drink 3 standard drinks of alcohol, showed lower inertia of their smiles. Their smiles were less predictable from one moment to the next. They were more responsive to the interaction, and their expressions of positive emotions followed that more closely. They also reported feeling better during the interaction and reported feeling more socially connected with others who they interacted with. This is not a recommendation to go out and have a drink, but as it turns out, this might be one of the reasons that researchers speculated that people, for example, with depression or people who tend to ruminate may be also more likely to drink alcohol and to develop alcohol-related disorders, because alcohol may temporarily alleviate their tendency to be emotionally stuck, if you like, in a particular state. Maybe a better, more long-term strategy would be to engage in exercise, because more recent research has suggested that engaging in exercise in the lab, in one study, helped people to recover faster from an upsetting emotional film that they watched. And in a very, very recent study, which is just about to come out, they showed that people who exercise more regularly in their daily lives also show lower levels of emotional inertia in daily life. So this is really exciting, and I think is a sort of under-researched area within psychology at least, looking at some of the psychological benefits of physical exercise. So before I wind up, you might be wondering after all this, is it ever good to be stable? Well, we tried to understand when it might be good to be stable in this particular study, conducted together with Peter Goodmans. What we did was again, you've seen this all before, we sampled people's emotions repeatedly across the day using smartphones. And we did this on one day during which they just went about their normal daily activities, nothing out of the ordinary. But on the second day, we continued to sample their emotions. And what we found was, as per normal, we found some people with high levels of emotional inertia, others with lower levels of emotional inertia. There were quite substantial differences, and they were related to the things that I've already mentioned: depressive symptoms, self-esteem, and so on. But crucially, on this second day, we asked people to come into the lab, and we told them they would have to do a very stressful task later that day. And this task involves being judged and evaluated by a panel of experts while giving a speech like I'm doing right now. And I can testify to the fact that it is stressful, and particularly in that moment or in that period that could be quite extended leading up to such an event. People do experience elevated anxiety and stress. And we were interested in how this would affect their level of emotional inertia. So we compared their levels of emotional inertia on the first day when they went about their normal daily activities to their levels of inertia on the second day when they had several hours to prepare for this stressful, socially evaluative task, which they then actually did. And what we found was that people who started off with high levels of inertia on the first day when they went about their normal daily lives became extremely emotionally unstable on the second day. In contrast, those who started off with more flexible emotions, lower inertia, they stayed pretty stable. Their fluctuations, their emotional fluctuations on that second day looked very similar to their fluctuations on the first. So what we think this means is that people who generally have higher levels of inertia under normal everyday circumstances may be unstably rigid. And if you think about what this means, it means that their emotions are stable like a glass bottle. Under normal circumstances, they appear to be stable. But in fact, when put under stress, it turns out they're fragile. In contrast, people who start out under normal circumstances as emotionally flexible seem to be stably flexible, which could be termed resilient. So that the ways in which their emotions change, their dynamics of their emotions, remain stably flexible when under stress. So we might modify the famous motto from Captain Nemo's ship to stabilis in mobili, rather than mobilis in mobili. Stably flexible. Okay, so I hope that I've convinced you that, at least partially convinced you that emotional stability isn't necessarily all it's cracked up to be. But if you don't believe me, then perhaps you believe Eeyore. He's a lovable character, but I think that he would be better off if his emotions were a little less stable and a little more flexible. Thank you very much.